I want to talk to you about a slippery slope. And I know, a slippery slope. Oh, my gosh. It's not a slippery slope. This is the way life happens. You don't go from good to evil overnight. It's a slow progression. It's progressive. You slowly get there. Because if you get there quickly, you're like, whoa, why am I surrounded with these people with the Nazi armbands? It starts slowly. So let me give you a couple of things first, right out of the news. Fauci, who is absolutely, I believe, a criminal. I was on Tucker Carlson last night. If you haven't seen my Fauci Lied special, go to FauciLiedSpecial.com. FauciLiedSpecial.com. I was going over it again yesterday because Tucker called and said, hey, can you make this point in 4 minutes? And I'm like, it was a 2-hour chalkboard. And I don't know if I did an effective job or not with it, but please watch FauciLied.com. There is criminal goings on. Fauci now says Americans should require holiday guests to prove vaccinations. Why is anybody listening to this guy? What prove your vaccination? Why? My relatives were all together just a couple of weeks ago. My mother-in-law now has COVID. Why? Because a family member who was vaccinated sat next to her and she was vaccinated. The family member didn't know it, but had COVID and passed it on to her. 2 vaccinated people. Prove you're vaccinated. What? Shut up. Shut up. 82% of Democrats, 82% of Democrats are willing to wear a face mask indoors at all times. There is a sickness going on, and you are not noticing the slide into insanity. It really is insane. You're willing to wear a mask indoors. You know, you drive down the road and you see people in their car all by themselves. You watch them at the store and they'll be touching their face and their eyes and everything else, but they've got that mask on, a cloth mask, which does hardly anything at all. Then they'll get into their car. They won't have washed their hands. They'll have touched the steering wheel and everything else, and they'll either take the mask off, which now the mask, which has all the bad stuff on it, is now sitting there in your car, in your hands, you're touching your mouth and your face in your car, or you're driving home all by yourself in the mask. What is happening? We have countries now that are putting people in internment camps, and it seems like a good idea to a lot of people.
The polling is actually really good on this in Australia.
Yeah.
I mean,
they love it.
We talked about this the other day. It's something like 64% of the population thinks the appropriate amount of risk they're willing to assume as a country is 100 deaths a year or less.
So let me tell you a story. It's a story about hostages, Ben and his wife, Ella. They dare not speak to the Japanese fighter pilot that glared at them down the barrel of his shotgun. It was December 13th, 1941. This was 6 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. It was on a tiny little island of Niihau. It's the westernmost inhabited island on the Hawaiian chain. The tense battle was not over. Ben, a burly Hawaiian farmhand, bided his time, eyeing his captors, waiting for just the right moment. The Japanese pilot handed the shotgun to a man named Harada. And in that split second, as they took their eyes off the 2 hostages, Ben saw an opening that he had been waiting for. He suddenly lunged for the shotgun. The pilot raised his pistol and squeezed off 3 rounds at Ben. But let me take you back 6 days earlier. Remember, that incident happened on December 13th. 6 days earlier, it was December 7th. a man who we're going to call Kale here for short because I have absolutely no idea how to pronounce his real Hawaiian name. He ran out of the house to investigate a loud noise that he had heard. Suddenly, a Japanese fighter plane surged into view, crash lands in front of his house. Now, this was during the second wave of the attack at Pearl Harbor. The plane was hit by U.S. fire, and the pilot had only been able to limp as far as the island of Niihau. Well, Kale pulled the dazed pilot from the wreckage. Somehow, in the process, Kale had the presence of mind to take the pilot's papers from the cockpit. And the other villagers quickly converged on the crash site, and they sent for an old man named Shintani. Shintani had been born in Japan and spoke Japanese, and Shintani conversed with the pilot. Then he left the scene and didn't say anything to the villagers. He just left. And so they sent for another guy named Harada, who also spoke Japanese. The pilot told Harada about the attack in Pearl Harbor, but nobody knew on Niihau about the attack on Pearl Harbor yet. So they didn't know that we were technically at war, and this guy, they just thought it was a pilot of a Japanese airplane that had been, that crash landed. They had no idea what had happened. And Harada didn't tell any of the villagers. Later in the day, the villagers heard about, over the radio, about the attack at Pearl Harbor. They realized this is an enemy. He was attacking. So the Hawaiians decided to detain the Japanese pilot until the proper authorities would come from Kauai. In the meantime, Harada and his wife offered to keep the pilot at their house, and the villagers agreed as long as he was kept under close watch. 4 days passed, and no word from the mainland. The island residents didn't know that the Navy had imposed an emergency travel ban between the islands, and so they didn't understand why nobody was coming. Meanwhile, as the week wore on, the pilot gained the trust of Harada and his wife, and they hatched a plan. It was Friday, December 12th. The old man, Shintani, offered Kale $200 for the pilot's papers, but Kale said, "I'm not giving them to you." Later that afternoon, the pilot and Harada pounced on the single villager who was on watch outside of Harada's house. They wrestled him into a nearby warehouse and locked him in it. Then they grabbed a shotgun and a pistol and made their way to Kale's house. Luckily for Kale, nature had called, and he was in his outhouse, and he saw them approaching his house. So he made a run for it. He ran towards the main village. Harada fired the shotgun at Kale, but missed. Harada and the pilot gave up their pursuit and rushed to the plane wreckage, where they tried to use the plane's radio, but it was broken. They set the plane on fire and returned to Kale's house and burned it down too. Meanwhile, Kale and 5 other villagers hopped in a boat and spent the next 15 hours paddling to Kauai for help. Harada and the pilot spent hours searching the island for Kale. And shortly after dawn on Saturday, December 13th, the desperate duo came across Ben Kanehile, I think it is, and his wife Ella. And they threatened to shoot the couple if they didn't give up Kale's whereabouts. Ben knew Kale and knew that he was on his way to Kauai, but he said, "I don't know." By early that afternoon, Kale had contacted the authorities on Kauai, and 12 U.S. Army soldiers were on their way to Niihau to apprehend the Japanese pilot. At the same time, Harada and the pilot still held Ben and Ella at gunpoint. Ben waited for just the right moment, and it was then that the pilot handed the shotgun to Harada. Ben suddenly lunged for it. The pilot raised his pistol and squeezed off 3 rounds, wounding Ben in the groin, the hip, and the ribs. Somehow, Ben kept surging towards the pilot, lifting him up and slamming him into a stone wall. His wife, Ella, sprang into action, grabbing a rock and bashed the pilot's head. Then Ben pulled out the hunting knife he happened to be carrying and slit the pilot's throat. Ben and Ella then spun around and found Harada aiming the shotgun at them. Then Harada turned the shotgun around and shot himself in the stomach. He died. When the 12 U.S. soldiers finally arrived, they rushed Ben to Kauai for medical treatment. He survived 3 gunshot wounds, later awarded a Purple Heart. The soldiers arrested Harada's wife and the old man Shintani. This made it to the New York Times. The headline ran, "Hawaiian with 3 bullet wounds beat Japanese airmen to death against a wall." So why am I telling you this story, and what does this have to do with anything? Because that's a hero story, right? That's a hero story. Here's somebody protecting the village. Here's somebody who did something great. But do you know what this led to? This made it into Congress's Pearl Harbor investigation, known as the Roberts Commission Report. And this story alarmed Americans. What you didn't know, most likely, is that FDR, he wanted to round up the Japanese long before they even struck Pearl Harbor. He was a racist that had a problem with the Japanese people, Japanese Americans. And once this report freaked America out, he used it to say, it could happen to you. You have Japanese around you? Don't you think we should round them up? Sometimes you can be convinced you're doing the right thing by violating people's rights, because you start to see these people as a danger, because powerful people with powerful words have convinced you that those people over there are the real danger. In times like these, you need to keep your head and your wits and your common sense and know that people use emergencies and use fear in ways that you and our nation will regret in the end.